Um, I was really touched by Graham's talk last week on when we listened to the story of Jacob being reunited with Esau, and I was thinking about that in the week. I'm thinking what an interesting prelude, if you like. You know, all the rage these days is to, once they've done Rocky 5, they do Rocky the Prelude, or whatever it is, the Prelude, or whatever else it is, so they have to tell you what happened before anything happened. And I was thinking about this with this story, actually, because the character Joseph we're going to see is the 11th son of Jacob. So this is child number 11, which those of you who can do your maths might think that's quite a lot of children, but there's more to come, actually, because there's 12 tribes of Israel, but he has this 11th child. But the important thing about Joseph is that Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob, but the first child of Rachel. And that's hugely significant because Rachel is the love of his life. You'll remember, won't you, the great story about Rachel and Leah. These two women represent for us very interesting contrast in the covenant, because Leah is the wife he was duped into marrying. Do you remember he was tricked by Laban, and he had the great wedding feast, and he woke up the following morning and he said, looking across to his new wife, thinking he was going to see Rachel, said, "Oh my God, it's Leah." And just so we're clear, for every man that's woken up and looked across and said, "Oh my God, it's Leah, not Rachel," there is a corresponding number of women who said, "Oh my God, it's Nabal, not David." So just so we're super clear about that, right? but nonetheless, and there he was, and of course he goes back to Laban, and the great trickster himself has been tricked. You remember, and he says, he said, "I came for Rachel. What is all this about?" And Laban says, "Well, you need to work another 7 years for her." And so there's this beautiful verse in Genesis and said, "And it seemed but a day to him." That's a really lovely thing to say, isn't it? Because he was so in love, it was but nothing to him. And there's something about that, you know, when you come home from work day after day and you're just so depressed and so fed up and so angry about everything else, and you look at the clock and it still only seems to be 2 o'clock and all the rest of it, you might not be doing something you love. Because when you love it, it just flies past you. It's very interesting. Anyway, Rachel is an interesting character because she follows in the footpath of Sarah, and she is barren. She can't have a child, as you will know. I told you this about all the patriarchs' wives are like this, and so she is in this really interesting dilemma because Rachel says to her husband Jacob, "You need to give me a child, or I'm going to die." And that is what you call high performance pressure, by the way. And Jacob says, "Well, who am I? Am I God? What's the matter with you?" But she'd been caught with this great problem because Leah, who was the unloved wife, she was having children one after the other after the other. I mean, this girl could have children just thinking about it while she was on the bus. It was ridiculous. And she had her 6th child, interestingly. She had a boy by the name of Levi. Listen to this. And she called the child Levi, and we wasted on you to say, of course, that Levi is the religious tribe. You know that, right? So she has a child called Levi, and here's what she declares: "Finally, now surely my husband will love me." Because she believed that she'd done enough work to put herself in a position where her husband would finally love her, which is why the child is called Levi. And the thing that Rachel didn't understand is Rachel, who was adored by Jacob, she didn't understand this principle, and it's one we must understand. There was nothing that Leah could do to make Jacob love her anymore, and there was nothing that Rachel could do or could not do that would cause Jacob to love her any less. And sometimes we just need to hold that in our minds, because I think we get caught up in this world of thinking, if only we were more fruitful, if only we were more productive, if only I've had 6 children now, or I've done 6 good works, or I've been on 6 missions, or I've done this, or I've done that, surely God will love me now. You are and can only be to God what Rachel was to Jacob. There's nothing else you can be. There's nothing you can do to make him love you any less, and there's nothing you need to do to make him any more, and make him love you anymore. That's not a thing. But eventually she has this child, and this is the miracle child, and his name is Joseph. And she has one more child that you'll know, whose name is Benjamin, and she dies in childbirth with Benjamin. And what was interesting, and I thought this struck me, Graham, when I was thinking about this week, was that it was on the birth of Joseph that Jacob goes to Laban and says, you need to let me go now. And it was almost as though it was okay for Jacob to be under the thumb, in captivity, if you like, whilst he had the children of the law. But now he's had the child of the promise. And now he's going to confront the greatest fear he has to confront, because he somehow has the courage, he somehow has it within him to go and do the thing that he really needs to do. And sometimes, by the way, change, and we only make the big changes, will either come through inspiration or desperation. But there's something that's happened to him that says, I need to go and reconcile with my brother. And indeed he does. And we heard the story beautifully narrated to us by Graham last week. But it was the trigger was the birth of Joseph, which I thought was very interesting. Now, Joseph is for sure, the clearest type of Christ in the entire Old Testament. You could argue with me that David is, and I can see why you would say that. But in terms of paralleling, step for step, movement for movement, Joseph's life is a foretelling of the Christ. It's just extraordinary, and I'll show you some of it in a second. But the thing I want you to hold on to is this. When you think about your dreams fading, and we've all been there, we all understand what that looks like. We've all had that moment of what the, delete expletive. We all know what that means. There is a secret that you can see in the life of this young man that it would serve us well to embrace. And here's the secret. You have to learn to live. Let me rephrase that. I have to learn to live. It's a good idea if you want to do it too. We have to learn to live at an elevation beyond our environment. Let me say it to you again. And let me say it to you in a different way. We have to learn to live at a level of consciousness that is above our circumstances. Now, if you've had the privilege of traveling, we've done a lot of traveling in our lives, and one of the things I'm always taken by is whenever you get to a peak of something. I stood with Haley at the Cristo looking over the whole of Rio de Janeiro, and when you stand at the top of the Cristo there and you look down, this vast, sprawling city just looks somehow it's just so in perspective, I guess. If you've ever been to the Empire State Building, you've looked over Manhattan, suddenly you just get a different perspective because you're on top of it. And there are times where you are under your circumstances. And when you're under your circumstances, you're not seeing from the right perspective. And there's a verse in Revelation that I'm going to come to today, and I'm going to maybe just pepper it because it's such an important statement. There's this very interesting verse in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, and it says this, and the Lord said, come up higher. And there comes a moment you have to just come up here, because sometimes your circumstances are so overwhelming that you need to be able to come up higher in order to get the right perspective. Because it's almost as though your circumstances are close up to you can't see with any clarity. Does anybody understand what I'm trying to say? That this notion of coming up here is important. So now watch, let me show you this. There's a little verse I was thinking about this morning in Hebrews 12, and it will segue us into the story. Here's what the writer in Hebrews says. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight, every sin, which clings so closely to us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Watch this next statement. Looking to Jesus. Looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith. Listen to this. Who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. Let me break that down for you really quickly because it's very important. Is it there for you? Okay, good. So the writer says, can I just say, you can only do this at the right altitude. You can only do this at a level of consciousness that is above your circumstances. You can only do this when your emotions and your thinking is bigger than your environment. Here's what he says. You are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Could you just think for a moment about the circumstances in which you currently find yourself? And would you dare to imagine that there is this gallery in the kingdom of God? And it's almost as though looking over this gallery, looking over this balcony, are all of the great saints that have gone before you. The Abrahams, the Josephs, the Moses, the Elijahs, the Elishas, the Daniels, the Samsons. I can just go on and on and on. And this great cloud of witnesses all knew what it was to live under their circumstances, but to rise above their circumstances. They all understood that. And they did it by this simple mechanism, by faith, by trust, by this locking their thinking into something that was greater than what they could see in front of them. So the writer says, let us lay aside every weight. How many of us are weighed down by anxiety, weighed down by guilt, weighed down by doubt, weighed down by judgment, weighed down by memories of the past, weighed down by experiences of when it didn't work out? And the writer says, please lay aside every weight and sin. Now remember, sin, be very careful about this. Sin is simply defined thus: unbelief in God. So the writer's saying, let us put aside every doubt, every fear, every worry, every anxiety, and all our unbelief in God that clings so closely to us. And instead, the writer says, let us run with endurance. And you know, don't you, those who wait upon the Lord, the scripture says in Isaiah, they will exchange their strength, right? They will run and they won't grow weary. They walk and they won't go faint. Looking to Jesus. And you see, this is so key. What happens to us when we're in the funk? What happens to us when we're in the grip of our circumstances? Who are we looking to? Do we look to our circumstances? Do we look to the number on the bottom of your bank statement? Do you look to the color of the bill? Do you look to who's not in your home? Do you look to where your children are? Whatever your thing is, do you look to that, or do you look unto Jesus? Are you able to focus your attention and your thinking on the one who is our life, the founder and the perfecter of faith? Because when he was as we are, and by the way, now we are as he is. I just do bear that in mind. But when he was as we are, here's how he lived his life. For the joy that was set before him, he despised the shame. In other words, he kept in his line of vision, he kept in his consciousness the glory of you. He kept in his consciousness that one day somewhere in some place in northwest London called Burnt Oak, which feels a long way from Bethlehem, that there would be these people that would gather on a Sunday morning and would raise their hands and they would sing, "Oh, come, let us adore him." And he said, for the joy that was set before me. That there would be this group of people that would talk about how they'd been healed by God's love. There would be this group of people that would just randomly decide that they would just give their time and give their food and give their stuff and just open this whole building up for anybody who was in this community just to come and feed and eat and be honored. Oh, for the joy that was set before him. He said, that's worth focusing. That I can get past the pain because of the joy that's set before me. And you see, women understand this, right? Let me just cut to the chase. Women understand this. The scripture tells us that the pain that you endure in childbirth is is easily forgotten. The amount of women I've heard, first-time mothers, I can't tell you the amount of times I've said this, I'm never having a child ever again, never doing that again. Well, 4 or 5 kids later, they're still saying it. But it's a powerful point. So what I'm asking you to hold that in your mind is because it's very easy, and the scripture goes on to say this, don't grow weary, because we know very well how easy that is. So with that in mind, I want to introduce this character to you. I want to introduce this beautiful, wonderful character to you. And I'm going to tell you his story in a very different way today. I'm not going to tell you line by line. I'm just going to tell you parallel by parallel. And then we'll come back some more and we'll do some more line by line stuff. But having said that, let me open it line by line. So here's Joseph's story. He's in Genesis chapter 37. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah and his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Well, we may question the wisdom of that, but now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. So I told you who he was. Something happened. Oh, you want me to move it? I'm so sorry. I thought you were doing I thought she was doing some really cool dance. I think that, notwithstanding your best efforts, Bademi, I think the battery died. Oh no, wait a minute, it's coming back. No, it's not. It's an operator problem, don't worry. Which is normally the case. There you go. So I told you about this character, but let's now look at some of these parallels, because I just want you to see this, because I want you to hold in your mind that when your dream fades, you need to have an elevated level of consciousness. You need to have a level of thinking and and an emotion that is higher than your circumstances. Look at this young man. Joseph is described as being beloved of his father. He really was. Do you remember the great baptism of Jesus? Do you remember what happened? The heavens open and the Father declares, "This is my beloved Son. This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased." Well, in the case of Jacob, Jacob said, "This is my beloved Son." And you'll know him because he's the one with the technicolored coat. He's the one with the glorious coat. But of course, that created a sibling rivalry in Joseph's life, which would be, you might think would be the undoing of him, but of course he was living at a higher level of consciousness than you or I are able to. And he was envied without any cause. And the scripture says this, when his brothers saw the father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. That's a tough break, isn't it? That people just hate you for no cause other than the fact that the Father loves you. We are living in a very strange world, by the way, where people hate people purely because they are loved by God or they love God. That's a very strange world to live in. Maybe you understand. Maybe you come from, I don't have siblings, so I don't know. But I am always, I'm always disappointed, if I'm honest with you, because I would love more than anything else to have brothers and sisters. That would be such a joy to me. And it makes me so heavy in my heart when I see siblings fighting with each other. I just don't understand it. Don't you know how privileged you are to have... I'm sorry, this is an orphan talking to you. You just don't get it. You don't get it. It's such a privilege for you to have blood relatives. It's just a privilege. But yeah, I watch and hear these stories and see this dysfunction within families. I think, my God, what is wrong with you? So she's the prettiest, get over it. So she's the smartest, deal with it. So he made the money. Come on. Really? Seriously? It says of Jesus, they hated me without cause. Can you imagine that? No cause whatsoever, they just hated him. Well, of course they hated Jesus, because Jesus represents to them end of business as usual. Because Jesus comes to end the whole religious racket that's been making these people a fortune. So they had a good cause to hate him, the truth be known. But then listen to this. He foretold that one day he would rule. You know, the great Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who used to be the minister at Westminster Chapel, who was made famous, oh goodness me, if you've ever can get hold of any of the old recordings of Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, they're so beautiful, particularly his teachings on Romans. But he said famously this, he said, "There's nothing worse than a young man becoming successful before he's ready." And I think that's a very nice thing to say. You need a level of maturity to carry the kind of gravity that was in the soul of this young man. Now watch. He comes back from seeing something, he has this dream, and he comes back and he says to his family, "Guess what happened to me today?" You go, "Oh really, what happened to you, Joe?" "Well, see, I had this dream." "Oh really, what happened in the dream?" "Well, basically this, I dreamt that all you were going to just bow down to me." "Really, Joseph?" "Yeah, it was great. It was marvelous. It was like these sheaths, and there you all were. It was just fabulous." And the dad went, "And me and your mother too?" "Oh yeah, you were there. It was great." It was like, "Joseph, you might need a little bit of help with this because this isn't going to do well." And of course, it doesn't do well for him. Interestingly, watch the parallel with Jesus. Jesus said, "It is said to you, nevertheless, I say to you hereafter, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming down in the clouds from heaven." Jesus knew it. He said, this is my destiny. And the thing that, despite the hubris, despite the immature way of sharing his truth with people, Joseph knew his truth. You know your truth. There is a truth that you carry that maybe you don't have. Maybe you feel too intellectually or socially arrogant to share, but you know that God has put something and some deep sense of purpose in your heart. You know he has. You know he has. And you may fear that if you tell everybody, they'll hate you. Well, they hate you anyway, so you may as well just tell them. And declare your truth. And Joseph had his truth, and Joseph would not be shaken from his truth. Watch this. He was accused of being a dreamer. That ever happened to you? My God, if you have ideas that are above the station and the environment in which you live in. Oh my God. I remember when I was in the orphanage, I had a psychologist come to do, we all had these psychologists come to see us. My one stayed with me quite a long time, but that's another story. And essentially, she said, "This boy has got ideas so far above himself, it's just terrifying." Because my mind could not accept the limitations of being an orphan. I just couldn't accept that. And the limitations that were set for me were things like, well, you know, you should get a job in a whatever, you know, the lowest possible job you could possibly imagine. And maybe one day you could, who knows, you know, maybe if all the stars aligned, you know, you might get a council house. So, but, that would have been a miracle now, right? But back then we used to get them because we were kids in the orphanage. They had to do something with us. But what I'm saying is everything was minimized, was dumbed down. It was no. And I was like, but I want to do, no. And I was always dreaming of bigger things. And I was always discouraged from that. And I know that you folks are no different to that. You have big dreams, and those dreams, you dare to share those with people, and they just dumb you down. And here's what the brothers said. And now this is for you, those who have siblings. Here comes the dreamer. Oh, yeah. You're the artist. Why don't you get a proper job like the rest of the family? Hello? Am I right or wrong? Why don't you work in the civil service and be a respectable person? Why don't you go and work go and work down the bank and go to work with a tie on and be a proper person? You think I came all the way from the Caribbean to let you sit around drawing pictures and running around and dancing on stages and doing all your foolishness? And you African people are even worse than that. I know what the West Indian experience is, right? I don't want to know what the African experience is like. The West Indian experience is tough. Right? Frank, I'll let you guys loose on that. I know it. But it's the same all over. Oh, here comes the dreamer. Here she comes. Airhead. Never got any money. Never got this, never got that. Jesus, they said of him, he's completely out of his mind, this man. He just thinks about these strange things all the time. But notice also he was sent by the father to seek his brother's welfare. The father said to Joseph, please go and see if it's well with your brothers and well with the flocks and bring back word to me. Jesus is exactly the same story, the story from Luke. Watch this for a parallel. He went willingly and he sought them until he found them. That's such an interesting perspective because from Joseph's point of view, Joseph just kept searching. They weren't where they should have been. So he went to Dothan and he went here and he went there and he finally found his brothers. Jesus came to search you out wherever you and I were. Parable of the lost coin, parable of the lost sheep, you know them as well as I do. But here's the thing. He came to his own and his own did not receive him. And Joseph went to his own and his own did not receive him. And sometimes you have to recognize that you and I will go to our own and our own won't receive us. The Bible tells you the prophet is never without honor, except in his own town. That's a strange business, isn't it? And Joseph, like Jesus, was rejected and condemned to die. The Bible says just bluntly, they conspired to kill him. These brothers of Jesus, it says, we will not let this man reign over us. And they began to shout, crucify him, crucify him. Joseph was stripped of his clothing. The Bible says they stripped him of his tunic, the tunic of many colors. Of Jesus, they stripped him, do you remember? And they drew lots for his garments, do you remember that? He was thrown into a pit and forsaken. I remember being at Bible school, someone said, we had a lecturer come one day and he always stuck with me. He said, do you know what a pit is? I said, what's a pit? And he said, a pit is a place for a prophet in training. And I thought that's a nice truth, that you need to recognize that. But watch Jesus. Jesus was thrown into the heart of the ground for 3 days, the same way. So I say this, that when you are envied, that when you are carrying a dream, that when that dream gets you in trouble, that when you are about your Father's business, that when you feel the rejection and the condemnation of others, that when you're stripped of all you have and when you're thrown away, that is the time you need to come up here. That's the time you need to come up here. The scripture says, after this I looked and behold a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice I had heard addressing me like a trumpet sound said, come up here and I will show you what must take place in the future. Come up here. Because Joseph's story isn't in the gun. He's sold for silver into the hands of the Gentiles. So was Jesus. For 30 pieces of silver, Joseph is traded for 20 pieces of silver. He's raised from the pit. So was Jesus. He becomes a servant. So did Jesus. Everything he did prospered. So did Jesus. But the reason everything he did prospered was because he came up higher. He kept focused. He kept intentional. He kept recognizing that for the joy that was set before him, there was going to come a moment that he knew even then, I promise you, when he was being thrown into the pit by his brothers, he knew that what the enemy intended for evil, God meant for good. He knew that even though his brothers had sent him to die, God had sent him ahead to save life. He knew that, and so he was able to stay focused on his task. He resisted temptation. Ryan's going to talk to you about that next week when he tells you the story of Potiphar's wife. So did Jesus. He was falsely accused. So was Jesus. He was numbered with the transgressors. So was Jesus. He was promised deliverance. He promised deliverance to a man that was condemned. So did Jesus. You remember the story of the baker? When you get out of here, please tell me. You remember the story? And he has the dream, and he tells the dream to the Pharaoh. He foretold the future accurately. So did Jesus. And he was a great counselor. So is Jesus. And because he lived and maintained that elevation, that level of consciousness, he was promoted to honor and has a name above every other name. So did Jesus. And guess what? All the people in Egypt were commanded to bow the knee to this man. It says in Genesis 41, they cried out before him, bow the knee. And so he set Joseph over Egypt. It says of Jesus, he did not consider equality as something to be grasped. Even though he existed in the form of God, but emptied himself and took on the form of a bondservant, humbling himself even to the point of death on the cross, so that he was given the name that is above all names, that every knee should bow, and every tongue would confess. But yet his people did not recognize him, nor did they recognize Jesus. His brothers were troubled, shaken to the core when they met Joseph, and well they might be, as they were with Jesus. Fantastically, interestingly, he allows his brothers to go through a period of tribulation. And this is one of the strongest reasons why there may be a tribulatory period. It's very interesting, and we'll come to that story in due course, but you probably know the Joseph story. There's that moment of tension between where the elder brother is kept in captivity, and he has to go back and get Benjamin. You remember the story? When Benjamin comes back with the father, then the release happens. And then there is this moment of revelation and reconciliation, which of course is the great Jesus story. But here's my point. Joseph had a dream. He had a vision for his life. And any time you have a dream that cannot be derailed by your circumstances, you can rest assured that that dream is your purpose. It's your purpose. And nothing can shake you from it. And the only way to ensure your dreams don't fade is, as I've said, is to ensure that your thinking is always higher than your environment. Because when your thinking is higher than your environment, your thinking can change your environment rather than your environment changing your thinking. You can make the change. But that is about the choice of how you're going to live and what you're going to live out of. And if you choose to live out of limiting emotion, then essentially know, won't you, that everything that's coming from you is based on your memories. Your memories create your thoughts create your feelings over time create your attitude creates your belief, and your belief creates your perceptions. And at the root, it's about your memory. Now, one way you can live like this, in fear, in doubt, in anger, in insecurity, and in judgment. That's a limiting way to live. It limits you, and it limits every possibility that is connected to you and everybody that's around you. Or you can elevate, and you can choose to live from love, from gratitude, from joy, from knowingness, from trust. And when you do that, my friends, when you are focused on that, and believe me, as you will see as we step through Joseph's story, there is no sense of fear, there is no doubt, there is no anger, there is no insecurity, there is no judgment. Instead, there's love, there's gratitude, there's joy, there's knowingness, and there's trust. And that causes him to prosper in everything he does. And I tell you, nobody can lack living like this. And nobody can gain living like that. You just can't. It's not possible. And if you would hold that in your mind and you would recognize that is the way of the Spirit, that is the pathway of the Spirit for you. And every time you feel the pull to come to the other side, to live on the red instead of the green side, hear the word of the Lord. Come up here. It's like they're saying, come back up here. What is the matter with you? You need to stand up on the Cristo again and look again out on the whole of Rio. You need to stand up here and look and see the perspective so you understand things from my perspective. You need to understand how the world looks like from the throne. You need to understand how it looks like as an ascended person. It says you are seated with him. You need to see life unfold and recognize that when you're sat in the throne room with God, this is your truth that you will recognize. All things are working together for good. Even things that don't feel good are working together for your good. The entire universe conspires to your good. It can't do anything else. It can't do anything else. Yet when we're living beneath our circumstances, it's kind of easy to forget that. Come up higher. And Joseph's story, as you know, we will see him abandoned in a pit, sold into slavery. But the moment he goes into Potiphar's house, what does he get? Favor. The favor comes upon him. He prospers. He's accused of raping Potiphar's wife. He's thrown into jail. He goes into jail. He prospers. It's not even possible. Such that he comes out and he becomes the prime minister of Egypt as a convicted rapist, by the way. That conviction was never quashed, and becomes the leader of all of Israel. How extraordinary. Why? Because he was able to keep his eyes focused. To go back to my original text. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, every sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So as I finish, I just want to invite you, if you find yourself right now in a pit, if the truth is that you find yourself living uncomfortably with the accusation of being a dreamer, if you find yourself as one who is rejected, if you have been stripped of your belongings, of your position, of your status, of your dignity, of your identity, if you've been left alone, if you've been forsaken, come up here. Come up higher. Father, I pray that we would hear you in me today, that for those whose dreams have faded, I pray, Father, that you would recalibrate, you would reset, you would cause us to be reminded of who we are. We would be reminded of who indwells us. We would be reminded that greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. We would be reminded that all things are working together for good. We will be reminded and be confident that we will never be overcome because you have overcome the world. Father, may your peace rest upon our people. May you bring into sharp focus the dreams and the purposes of your people that have been left alone, stripped, abandoned, thrown into a pit. And you would cause the Josephs and the Josephines to arise and to know that God meant it all for good. Amen.